The cold vacuum of space was silent, as it always was, except for the faint hum of the ancient Cryo ship drifting in the farthest reaches of the galaxy. This ship was once a symbol of humanity's might, a vessel carrying the finest warriors from Earth, frozen in time and space, waiting for a future they could never imagine. The Galactic Empire, a vast and powerful entity that ruled over the stars, had never cared about this ship. To them, it was nothing more than an old relic, something of little consequence, until the day they stumbled upon it. The Empire's engineers, always searching for new ways to expand their power and knowledge, had discovered the ship floating near a forgotten planet on the outer rim. They assumed it was just another piece of debris from humanity's failed attempts to conquer the stars, a long-lost treasure trove of data and technology they could study and perhaps use for their own gain. But they had no idea what they were about to awaken. With mechanical precision, they docked their ships to the Cryo ship and began their investigation. The ship's systems were old, its technology centuries behind the Empire's own, but it still held secrets. The frozen soldiers inside were once the cream of humanity's elite forces, each one genetically enhanced and cryogenically preserved for a future that had never come. But to the Empire, they were nothing more than relics, beings frozen in time, their bodies little more than corpses that could be dissected and studied for fun. Primitive, muttered an Imperial scientist, inspecting one of the Cryo chambers through a glass panel. These humans never stood a chance. They were wrong. A single spark of electricity, a single mistake. As the scientist leaned closer to inspect the Cryo chamber, the ship's ancient systems suddenly roared to life. A pulse of energy shot through the walls, and the cryogenic suspension chambers flickered. One by one, the frozen soldiers began to stir. The scientist stepped back in shock, his heart racing. He hadn't expected this. The Cryo chamber he was standing beside let out a soft hiss as the thick frost melted away. Inside, a soldier's eyes snapped open, glowing with the unmistakable gleam of awareness. The soldier, tall, broad-shouldered, and scared from battle, sat up, his muscles flexing as if he'd never been asleep. His name was Captain Marcus Kane, a name forgotten by history, but etched deeply into the minds of those who had served alongside him. Kane's eyes darted around the room, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. His mind was sharp, his senses alert. The hissing sound of the chamber opening seemed deafening in the silence of space, but the soldier's gaze was focused, calculating. What is this?" he murmured, his voice thick from the long slumber. His hand gripped the edge of the chamber as he slowly stood, his joints groaning from centuries of inactivity. Around him, more chambers began to unlock. More soldiers, men and women, began to stir, their eyes glowing with the same alertness. They were all warriors, bred for war and survival, trained to fight in a universe that had no mercy. They were humanity's last hope, and now they were awake. The Empire's engineers had no idea what they had just unleashed. The soldiers stretched, their bodies adjusting to the sudden shift from freezing cold to the warm air of the ship. Their minds were sharp, instantly processing everything around them. It didn't take long for them to realize that they were no longer on Earth, and they were not in their own time. The ship they were aboard was of alien design, far beyond anything humanity had ever built. The leader of the soldiers, Captain Kane, took charge immediately. He moved with precision, his training kicking in as though it had never left him. He scanned the surroundings, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, only to find it gone. The soldiers were armed only with what little they had left, fists, knives, and their own wits. But that was all they needed. "We are not alone," Kane said, his voice low but filled with command. "We have to figure out where we are, who did this, and what we can do to get back to Earth." As the soldiers gathered, taking stock of their situation, the engineers and scientists from the Galactic Empire were still oblivious to the growing danger. They were busy marveling at the ancient relics they had discovered, mocking the humans they thought they could easily control. But the soldiers were not relics. They were living, breathing warriors who had been trained for battle, and their training had not dulled in the centuries they had been asleep. They were the best humanity had ever produced, and they had been asleep for far too long. The ship's alarms suddenly blared, signaling an emergency. The Empire had discovered something, and they were rushing to investigate. "What is that noise?" one of the soldiers asked, her voice filled with confusion. "It's time," Kane said grimly. "We've been asleep for too long, but now we're awake, and we're going to make sure they never forget us." The Empire had made a grave mistake. They had mocked humanity, underestimated its strength, and forgotten the warriors that once protected it. Now, those warriors were awake, and they were ready to show the Empire what humans were truly capable of. The soldiers moved quickly, their minds working in perfect unison as they navigated the dark, narrow corridors of the Cryo ship. They had no cloaking devices, no advanced technology to speak of, but they had something far more powerful: the will to survive and the heart of a warrior. Kane led them with unwavering confidence, his eyes scanning the hallway as they approached a large bay door. The soldiers were still disoriented, but the battle instincts that had been programmed into them over centuries kicked in immediately. "Stay alert," Kane ordered, his voice low but commanding. "We don't know what we're up against yet." They reached the bay door and began to breach it, their military training kicking into high gear. As the door slid open, they were greeted by the sight of dozens of Empire soldiers, standing at attention, ready to face whatever threat had emerged from the Cryo ship. The Empire soldiers sneered at the newcomers, dismissing them as nothing more than old frozen humans who couldn't possibly stand up to the Empire's technological superiority. But they were wrong. The Cryo soldiers stepped forward, their muscles rippling with strength. The first move came from Kane, who launched himself at the Empire soldiers with an unmatched speed and ferocity. The others followed suit, attacking with precision and skill. The fight was over before it had even begun. The Empire soldiers were no match for the ancient warriors. As the last of the Empire soldiers fell, Kane stood victorious, his chest heaving with exertion. He turned to his team, his eyes burning with a new purpose. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is just the beginning." The Galactic Empire had mocked them. Now, they would learn to fear them. The Empire's first encounter with the human Cryo soldiers had been brutal and unexpected. But as the last of their soldiers fell to the superior combat tactics of the Cryo-awakened humans, the Empire still did not fully comprehend the scale of the threat they now faced. The corridors of their space station, once secure and under their control, now echoed with the sounds of humanity's elite soldiers, moving through the ship with purpose and precision. The Empire had underestimated them from the very beginning, thinking them weak and helpless. Now they were quickly realizing their mistake, but it might already be too late. Captain Marcus Kane and his team were not just survivors. They were warriors, bred for combat, trained in the harshest conditions, and tested through every battle humanity had ever faced. Their physical abilities were enhanced, their minds sharp from centuries of hibernation, and their instincts were honed like a razor's edge. They had been frozen in time, but the galaxy had not forgotten them, nor had they forgotten how to fight. Despite the initial victories, the Empire's officers still could not fathom the extent of the human threat. They saw only relics of a bygone era, soldiers from a forgotten war, too old to be any real danger to their empire. The Imperial generals and officers looked down upon the humans as though they were nothing more than strange, outdated relics, incapable of any serious resistance. In the briefing rooms of the Imperial fleet, officials discussed the situation. They assumed that the human soldiers were simply an anomaly, something they could easily eliminate once they gathered their forces. The fact that they had been awakened from cryo sleep did not seem like enough of a challenge. After all, they'd reasoned, these humans were not equipped with the advanced weaponry of the Empire. They didn't have the experience or the tactical knowledge to defeat them. One Imperial officer, General Zorin, stood at the head of the room, analyzing the data. His arrogance was evident as he scoffed at the idea of a human uprising. "They were frozen for centuries," he said with a dismissive laugh. "How could they possibly match our technology? These humans have no place in this galaxy anymore." Zoran's words were meant to reassure the others, to calm their growing anxiety, but it did little to ease the tension in the room. There was something unsettling about the way the human soldiers had fought. It wasn't just their physical prowess. It was the look in their eyes. They had fought like soldiers on a mission, not like relics stumbling out of time. Zoran couldn't shake the feeling that they were underestimating something far more dangerous than they realized. Kane and his soldiers, meanwhile, had no intention of backing down. They had awakened to a universe that was unfamiliar and hostile, but their instincts were sharp, and they knew exactly what needed to be done. They had spent years in cryo sleep, but the memories of their training and the battle strategies they had once mastered came rushing back to them. As the Imperial forces regrouped, the human soldiers quickly adapted to their new environment. They were in unfamiliar territory, but that didn't matter to them. In their minds, they were still fighting the same battle, even though the enemy was different. And now that they had tasted victory, they were hungry for more. Kane wasn't the type to wait around for the Empire to make the first move. He knew that if they were to survive, they would need to strike first, before the Empire could gather enough forces to crush them. His mind raced as he surveyed the layout of the Imperial base, quickly assessing the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a strategist, and he would use everything at his disposal to turn the tables. "Listen up," Kane said to his team, his voice firm and commanding. "We can't afford to let them regroup. We strike now, while they're still underestimating us. We have the element of surprise on our side. Let's make it count." His soldiers, though battle-worn and disoriented from their long hibernation, quickly fell in line, eager to prove themselves. They moved swiftly, using the ship's ventilation shafts and hidden passages to navigate through the station without being detected. The Imperial officers and soldiers continued their underestimation, thinking the humans were simply trying to hide or regroup. They failed to recognize the humans were outsmarting them at every turn. The Empire's reliance on their superior technology was their biggest mistake. While the Empire had advanced weaponry, robots, and artificial intelligence on their side, the humans had something far more dangerous: human ingenuity. Kane and his soldiers understood the value of surprise, and they used every opportunity to exploit the Empire's overconfidence. The Empire had relied too heavily on their technology and underappreciated the power of a human's will to survive. As the human soldiers made their way through the station, they encountered small pockets of resistance. The Empire's robots, designed to be the ultimate defenders of the station, were no match for the humans. They fought with precision, taking down the robotic forces with ease. The humans didn't need the latest technology to defeat the Empire's machines. They used their experience and cunning to outmaneuver them. Each time an enemy robot was disabled, it was a victory not just for the soldiers, but for humanity's spirit. Meanwhile, the Empire's generals and officers continued to make their plans, still confident in their victory. They had gathered reinforcements, and they believed that the humans, weakened by their long sleep, would be no match for the full might of the Empire's forces. They did not realize, however, that each time they dismissed the humans as nothing more than relics, they were unknowingly pushing them closer to the breaking point. The humans were more than just survivors of a forgotten time. They were warriors, and they would not go down without a fight. The first major clash came when the humans managed to disable the station's main power grid, throwing the Empire's forces into chaos. The lights flickered and dimmed as the station was plunged into darkness, and the once overconfident Empire soldiers scrambled to restore order. The humans, however, moved like shadows in the night, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. They took out communication systems, cutting off the Empire's ability to coordinate their response. The Empire was now on the defensive, and they had no idea how to fight back. As Kane and his team advanced deeper into the station, they encountered a squadron of Imperial soldiers sent to capture them. The Empire thought they could handle the humans in hand-to-hand combat, but they were wrong. The humans fought with a ferocity that the Empire had never seen before. They used their environment to their advantage, launching surprise attacks from all directions. The Empire's soldiers were disoriented and overwhelmed, unable to keep up with the relentless pace set by the humans. In the midst of the chaos, Kane's mind raced with calculations. He could feel the tide of battle shifting. He had to act fast, or the Empire would regroup and counterattack with everything they had. He knew they didn't have much time. He turned to his team, giving them one last command before the next wave of attacks. We take this station, or we die trying. But we fight like humans. We fight with everything we've got. With that, they launched themselves back into battle, determined to prove to the Empire that humanity was not to be underestimated. The battle for survival was far from over, and the Empire had no idea what they were about to face. The humans were no longer just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their future. And they were about to make the Empire regret ever underestimating them. The Empire had thought that a few bursts of resistance would be easy to crush, but they were gravely mistaken. The humans who had awakened from Cryo's sleep were not the helpless relics they had assumed. As the last of the Empire's reinforcements were sent to counter the human threat, they were met with a force unlike anything they had expected. It was clear now. This was not a simple uprising. This was the beginning of a resistance. Captain Marcus Kane and his soldiers had only just begun. Their early successes had proven to the Empire that they were more than just threats to be extinguished. But even as the humans had gained ground, Kane knew that the real battle was only just starting. The Empire's superior firepower, vast fleets, and automated war machines had been overwhelming. But Kane understood one fundamental truth. They were not prepared for humanity's resourcefulness. And he knew that it was that very resourcefulness that would turn the tide in their favor. The first days after the initial skirmishes were brutal. The Empire scrambled to reassert control, sending wave after wave of robotic soldiers and drones to hunt down the human fighters. But the humans didn't fight like typical soldiers. They fought like survivors, each move calculated, each strike personal. They had nothing to lose, and that made them incredibly dangerous. As the days wore on, the cries of the Empire's machines rang through the station, each one dismantled and rendered useless by the hands of the humans. And every failure they suffered only strengthened the human resolve. Kane had gathered his forces in what remained of the station's abandoned communications room, a darkened space with flickering screens and static-filled terminals. The air was thick with anticipation. The humans had stolen some of the Empire's data from their wrecked systems and now had a glimpse of their enemies' weaknesses. But Kane knew that there was no time to waste. They had to hit the Empire hard before they regrouped and mounted a larger defense. The humans had already taken down several sections of the station, and now they had to move quickly to cripple the Empire's main weapon supply. Kane looked at his soldiers, their faces worn and tired from the constant fighting, but their eyes burned with determination. "The next step is crucial," he said, his voice steady, but urgent. "We're not just going to wait for them to come to us. We're going on the offensive. We've taken out their machines. Now it's time to take out their weapons." The plan was risky, but Kane knew it was their best shot. They would infiltrate the heart of the Empire's weapons bay, a heavily fortified location deep within the station, and sabotage their arsenal. If they could succeed in cutting off the Empire's ability to resupply and rearm, it would buy them precious time to regroup and strike again. But the risk wasn't just the mission. It was the Empire's growing awareness of the human threat. The more the humans fought back, the more the Empire would take them seriously. The Empire's high command was no longer simply looking at the humans as a nuisance. They saw them as a real challenge to their authority. This meant that the Empire would send everything they had to wipe them out. As Kane and his soldiers made their way deeper into the station, they encountered more resistance. But unlike the first few skirmishes, this time, they weren't facing robotic soldiers. They were facing real enemies, well-trained Imperial soldiers who were coming at them with everything they had. The air was thick with the sounds of gunfire and the harsh, mechanical growls of the Empire's drones. But the humans were undeterred. Every step they took was calculated, every movement planned. They used their surroundings to their advantage, slipping through ventilation shafts, taking advantage of blind spots, and using the station's dark corridors to strike without warning. Despite their intense training and expertise, the humans had to fight on multiple fronts. It wasn't just the enemy forces they had to worry about. It was the very environment itself. The station was a labyrinth of hallways, storage rooms, and maintenance tunnels, many of which had become dangerous and unstable due to the earlier sabotage. Explosions rang out around them as the Empire desperately tried to take back control, but Kane and his soldiers pressed on. The resistance wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving. The humans knew that they couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every decision had consequences, and every fight could be their last. Kane understood that the Empire's high-tech machinery and weapons would eventually overwhelm them if they didn't act swiftly. But they had one advantage. They were humans, and they could think outside the box. They weren't bound by rigid protocols or robotic logic. When faced with impossible odds, they adapted. It was in one of the station's lower levels that Kane and his soldiers made their breakthrough. They had breached a heavily fortified section and now stood in front of the Empire's main weapons storage bay. The large metallic doors loomed before them, reinforced and locked. But Kane wasn't concerned about the door. His mind was already racing with a plan. The humans might not have the same technology as the Empire, but they had explosives, an old but reliable method of breaking through enemy defenses. "We'll plant the charges here," Kane said, pointing to the weakened structural points on the door. "In 10 minutes, this place will come down. Stay sharp." The soldiers quickly set to work, planting the explosives with expert precision. As the minutes ticked down, tension ran high. The station was on high alert, and they could already hear the sound of enemy soldiers approaching. Kane knew they didn't have much time. If the Empire caught them before the explosives went off, they would be surrounded and outnumbered. It would be a massacre. When the countdown hit 0, the explosion was deafening. The door to the weapons bay shattered, sending chunks of metal flying in every direction. The humans rushed in, weapons drawn, as the first wave of enemy soldiers stormed the hallways. The battle inside the weapons bay was chaos. The humans moved like ghosts, their movements fluid and deliberate, as they took down Imperial soldiers with calculated precision. The Empire's soldiers fought back fiercely, but they were no match for the humans' speed and tactics. Kane fought with a focus he hadn't felt in years, his heart pounding in his chest. This was their moment. They were finally striking back, and they weren't going to stop until they had secured their future. As the weapons bay finally fell under their control, Kane took a moment to catch his breath. The soldiers were exhausted, but their victory was hard-earned. For the first time since they had awakened, they could feel the tide of the battle shifting. They were no longer just survivors, they were the resistance, and they had just dealt a powerful blow to the Empire's plans. But Kane knew the war was far from over. This was only the beginning. The Empire would not let this defeat go unanswered. They would regroup, and they would come at them harder. But for now, the humans had a brief moment to celebrate. They had begun their fight, and there was no turning back. The resistance had truly begun. The moment the weapons bay fell into human hands, there was a fleeting sense of victory. But Marcus Kane knew it was just the calm before the storm. The Empire wouldn't take this loss lightly. This was a galactic empire, used to crushing anything that dared challenge its might. Kane and his soldiers were a thorn in the side, but they were an effective one. What they had done so far wasn't just a setback for the Empire. It was a declaration of war, and it was clear. The Empire would retaliate with all its power. As the humans celebrated their victory within the weapons bay, they knew it was only a matter of time before the Empire's forces would come crashing down upon them. The explosion that had ripped apart the heavy metallic doors had sent shockwaves through the entire station, And now, alarms blared throughout the facility, signaling that the Empire's fleet was deploying reinforcements. The Empire was mobilizing its elite forces, and they would not be as easily defeated as the earlier waves. Kane gathered his soldiers around the makeshift command center they had set up inside the weapons bay. There wasn't much to work with. A few communications consoles, some hastily arranged chairs, and a single map of the station. But it was enough. The soldiers were gathered around, their faces serious, their bodies tired from the earlier skirmishes. Despite the victory, the look in their eyes told Kane everything he needed to know. They were ready for more. "We've hit them hard," Kane began, his voice steady and firm. "But now, they'll hit back even harder. We need to fortify our position and hold it at all costs. We've secured their weapons, but now we need to keep them from retaking this place. If we lose this, we lose everything." The soldiers nodded in agreement. They knew what was at stake. The weapons were their only leverage against the Empire, and they needed to use them wisely. Outside, the station had grown eerily quiet. The sounds of battle had momentarily ceased, but Kane knew that wasn't a good sign. It meant that the Empire was regrouping. They would not let a small band of humans jeopardize their control over the galaxy, and if they had to wipe out every last human soldier, they would. Sure enough, within hours of securing the weapons bay, the Empire's retaliation began. The sound of boots marching in unison echoed through the hallways, and the hum of their advanced war machines was unmistakable. Imperial war droids, a deadly blend of metal and artificial intelligence, were deployed in full force, and they marched toward the weapons bay with frightening precision. Kane knew this was coming, but the scale of the assault was overwhelming. As the Empire's forces closed in, Kane issued orders for his soldiers to get into position. He couldn't afford to let the Empire retake the weapons. Every human here had a role to play, and there would be no second chances. "Set up your defenses," Kane barked. "We hold the line here, no matter what. If they want the weapons, they'll have to fight for it." The battle outside the weapons bay grew intense. The Empire's elite soldiers and war droids stormed the corridors, cutting down anything in their path. The human soldiers fought back with everything they had, using the weapons they had stolen from the Empire to hold off the relentless advance. Explosions rocked the station as grenades were thrown into the enemy's ranks, while makeshift barricades were set up to slow their progress. But the Empire had numbers, and their technology was far more advanced. The war droids were nearly indestructible, their armored exteriors making them almost impervious to gunfire. The soldiers couldn't match the firepower the Empire wielded, and they quickly realized that they would have to rely on their ingenuity to survive. It was in this moment that Kane realized something. The Empire's forces might have been technologically superior, but the humans had something that the Empire didn't. They had the will to fight, and they weren't about to give up now. "We need to buy time," Kane said, his voice low but filled with determination. "We can't win this fight outright, but we can delay them. We make every shot count, and we force them to waste their resources. We fight smarter, not harder." Kane's words sparked a fire within his soldiers. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a cause. This was bigger than them. This was humanity's chance to prove that they could stand against an empire that had crushed countless civilizations before them. The Empire underestimated humanity once, but they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. As the battle raged on, the humans employed guerrilla tactics, using the station's complex architecture to their advantage. They laid traps, ambushed enemy soldiers in narrow hallways, and used every ounce of their cunning to keep the Empire's forces at bay. Every victory, no matter how small, fueled their resolve. With each fallen droid, the humans grew more confident in their ability to stand up to the Empire. But as much as they succeeded, the Empire's relentless assault began to take its toll. Casualties began to mount. Every fallen soldier was a blow to the resistance, but it was the death of Bonner, their most seasoned soldier, that hit them hardest. Bonner had been the heart of the resistance. His calm demeanor, sharp mind, and unshakable bravery, had inspired everyone around him. Losing him in battle was a devastating blow, but it was also a stark reminder that the humans were fighting against impossible odds. It wasn't just about winning, it was about survival. Kane looked over the battlefield, his heart heavy with the loss of Bonner. But there was no time to grieve. The Empire was closing in fast. His soldiers were tired, their morale low, but they still had fight in them. They would hold the line. They had to. In the middle of the chaos, a sudden shift occurred. The Empire had brought in its heavy artillery, massive cannons capable of laying waste to entire sections of the station. The weapons bay was directly in the line of fire. If they didn't act fast, everything they had worked for would be destroyed. "We need to move now," Kane shouted, his voice urgent. "Fall back to the next position and set up defenses. We're not going down without a fight." As the humans retreated, they set traps along the way, using their limited resources to slow the Empire's advance. The next few hours were a blur of explosions and gunfire, with the humans barely staying ahead of the Empire's advancing forces. But despite the odds, despite the overwhelming firepower the Empire had at its disposal, the humans refused to give up. Kane knew they couldn't keep this up forever, but they had managed to buy themselves precious time. And time was exactly what they needed. Time to regroup, time to strategize, and time to prepare for the next phase of the war. The battle for control of the station was far from over, but the humans had shown the Empire one undeniable truth. They would not go down without a fight. The station was now a war zone. The constant blaring of alarms, the flashing red lights, and the deafening sounds of explosions had become the new normal. Kane and his soldiers had been fighting tooth and nail, constantly on the move, using every trick in the book to stay one step ahead of the Empire's forces. But even the most seasoned soldiers had their limits. Fatigue had begun to take its toll. The once proud resistance had been whittled down, and the Empire's unrelenting assault had left them on the brink of collapse. But Kane refused to give in. Every inch of the station they had taken, every battle they had won, had only solidified his resolve. The Empire thought they could crush humanity beneath their boot, but they had underestimated the most important thing about the human race: their ability to adapt, to fight, and to survive. Kane had seen it firsthand, from the very first skirmish to the current hell they were enduring. Humanity had something the Empire couldn't understand: a fierce, unyielding spirit. It was this spirit that kept them going, even when all seemed lost. The war had reached a fever pitch. The Empire had brought in its deadliest forces, newly engineered war droids with advanced AI that could think and act on their own. They were faster, smarter, and more deadly than the ones they had fought before. And they weren't alone. The Empire's elite soldiers had joined the fray, heavily armored and armed with weapons that made the human soldiers' makeshift arsenal seem like toys in comparison. It was no longer just a battle for the weapons bay. It was a fight for the entire station. Kane knew that they couldn't keep up the fight much longer. The Empire's forces were overwhelming, and the humans were running out of resources. They needed something more. They needed a plan, a way to turn the tide in their favor. That's when it hit him. The Cryo soldiers. When the humans had first entered the station, they had discovered the Cryo chambers, the last remnants of humanity's greatest military soldiers, long forgotten in time. They were kept in stasis, their bodies preserved for a future that would never come. The Empire had written them off as useless relics, but Kane knew better. These soldiers were humanity's last hope. They had the training, the skills, and the experience to fight against the Empire. But they were locked away, frozen in time, just waiting for the right moment to awaken. Kane had been hesitant at first. He didn't know if the Cryo soldiers would even be able to function after all these years. Would they still be the warriors they once were? Or had time eroded their minds, their bodies, and their will to fight? It was a gamble, but it was one he was willing to take. "We're bringing them out," Kane said, his voice steady with resolve. "We need every soldier we can get. We can't afford to wait any longer." His soldiers looked at him, unsure at first, but they trusted him. They had seen him lead them through the worst of times. They had seen his determination. If Cain believed this was their best chance, then they would follow him. The cryo chamber room was dimly lit, the air cold and sterile. The chamber doors stood tall, silent, and imposing. Cain knew that inside each of these chambers was a warrior who had once fought for the future of humanity. It was time for them to fight again. With a quick signal, the chamber doors slid open. Inside, rows upon rows of cryo soldiers lay in stasis. Their bodies were still, but Cain could almost feel the power that slept within them. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. One by one, he activated the cryo chambers, the deep hum of machinery filling the room as the soldiers began to stir. The first soldier to wake was Sergeant Dalton. He was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that was scared from years of battle. His eyes flickered open, and for a moment he seemed disoriented. But the moment he took in his surroundings, something clicked in him. His instincts kicked in, and he immediately rose to his feet, scanning the room like a hawk. "What's going on?" Sergeant Dalton asked, his voice gruff, but strong. "We're at war," Cain said, meeting his gaze, "and we need your help." Dalton didn't hesitate. Without a word, he nodded and followed Cain out of the chamber. He wasn't the only one. As the cryo soldiers awoke, they immediately fell in line, ready to fight. It was like flipping a switch. These soldiers hadn't lost their edge. They were just waiting for the right moment to strike. The reinforcements had arrived, and they were just as ruthless as the Empire's finest. Cain and the cryo soldiers moved quickly, regrouping with the remaining human forces. The fight was about to get even more intense. The Empire had underestimated humanity before, but now they were going to learn just how deadly the human spirit could be when pushed to its limits. The turning point came when the human soldiers, now bolstered by the strength and expertise of the cryo soldiers, launched a surprise offensive against the Empire's command center. It was a bold move, one that could either succeed spectacularly or end in complete disaster. But Cain wasn't afraid. This was their only shot. The attack was swift and brutal. The cryo soldiers, with their combat experience and enhanced reflexes, cut through the Empire's defenses like a hot knife through butter. They were unstoppable. The Empire's forces, caught off guard by the sudden onslaught, were thrown into chaos. The war droids, despite their advanced programming, couldn't adapt fast enough to counter the human strategy. Cain led the charge, cutting through the Empire's soldiers with precision. He wasn't just a leader, he was a warrior. And in this moment, he was leading humanity's final stand against an empire that had once believed it was invincible. The Empire retaliated with everything it had. Explosions rocked the station, and the walls trembled under the force of the Empire's assault. But the humans pressed on, undeterred. They were fighting for more than just survival now. They were fighting for the future of humanity. As the battle raged on, the tide began to turn in their favor. The Empire's forces, once so confident in their superiority, were now struggling to hold their ground. They had underestimated the human cryo soldiers, and it was costing them dearly. In the heart of the station, Cain finally reached the Empire's command center. It was heavily fortified, but nothing could stop him now. He was determined to finish what they had started. The final battle was about to begin. But even as he prepared to make his move, Cain couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was yet to come. The Empire had been relentless, but this wasn't the end of the war. It was only the beginning. Cain glanced at his soldiers, his comrades. They had come so far, and they weren't going to stop now. The turning point had arrived, and with it, the hope that humanity could rise up, against all odds, and fight back. They had the power to change the course of this war, and they would do whatever it took to win. The Empire had made a grave mistake. They had thought humanity was nothing more than a relic of the past. But now, they were going to see what humanity was truly capable of. The heart of the station was alive with chaos. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground shook beneath the feet of those who dared to stand against the Empire. Kane and his soldiers had fought long and hard, but the battle was far from over. Now, as they pushed deeper into the Empire's command center, they could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. This was it, the final confrontation. The Empire's forces were concentrated in the command room, a vast, sterile chamber that once served as the nerve center for the entire station. It was a room built for control, for power, but now it had become the last battleground in a war that had already claimed countless lives. Kane stood at the entrance, his pulse steady, his mind clear. He had led his soldiers through hell and back, but this was the moment that would define their legacy. Inside, the Empire's elite soldiers waited. Clad in thick, black armor, they were a formidable force, strong, trained, and prepared for anything. But they were up against more than just soldiers. Kane had brought with him the strength of humanity's forgotten warriors, the Cryo soldiers, and they were ready to show the Empire just how wrong they had been. The Empire had underestimated them, and now it was time to prove the cost of that mistake. Kane's heart raced, but it wasn't fear that drove him. It was something far stronger. Rage. The rage of a people who had been pushed to the brink, who had been mocked and discarded, yet still managed to rise up and fight. It was a rage fueled by the loss of friends and comrades, by the countless sacrifices that had been made to get to this point. And it was a rage that would see the Empire crumble to dust. He turned to Sergeant Dalton, who stood beside him, eyes hard and focused. "Ready?" Kane asked, his voice low. Dalton nodded, his hands gripping the hilt of his weapon. "Let's finish this." With a single command, the human forces surged forward, the Cryo soldiers leading the charge. The Empire's elite soldiers raised their weapons, preparing for the oncoming assault, but they were not prepared for the ferocity of the attack. The Cryo soldiers moved like a storm, their every movement calculated, precise. They tore through the Empire's lines, taking down one soldier after another with ruthless efficiency. Kane was right behind them, his own soldiers pushing forward with a determination that could not be stopped. The sound of gunfire echoed through the chamber, but it was drowned out by the shouts of battle and the crash of metal against metal. This was a fight for survival, for freedom, and for humanity's future. Despite the chaos, Kane's mind remained sharp. He had seen battles before, but nothing like this. The Empire's soldiers were powerful, yes, but they were not prepared for the sheer willpower of the human fighters. Kane could see it in their eyes. Fear. The fear that comes when you realize that you've underestimated your opponent. And now, there's no way out. The humans pushed forward, taking the Empire's soldiers down one by one. They were closing in on the heart of the command center. Kane knew that their victory was within reach, but there was still one last hurdle to overcome. The leader of the Empire's forces, General Kale, stood at the far end of the chamber. He was a towering figure, dressed in the finest armor the Empire had to offer. His eyes burned with contempt as he watched his soldiers fall around him. He had seen the humans as nothing more than relics of a forgotten age. But now, standing in the midst of the battle, he was beginning to understand just how wrong he had been. Kane and Dalton were the first to reach him. The general's cold, calculating gaze locked onto Kane as the two men faced each other across the battlefield. Kane could see the hate in Cal's eyes, but he didn't flinch. He had no time for hatred anymore. All that mattered was ending this war. "So this is how it ends." Cal's voice was like ice, his hand resting on the hilt of his massive sword. "With you, a relic of a forgotten race, leading these pathetic excuses for soldiers." Kane's response was a simple one. He didn't need to say much. The years of pain, the countless battles, and the countless lives lost all came crashing down in that moment. He raised his weapon, his eyes never leaving Cal's. "You've made your mistake, General. Now you'll pay the price." Cal sneered, drawing his sword with a swift motion. "I don't think you're in any position to talk about mistakes, human." With a battle cry, Kale charged, his sword raised high. Cain didn't flinch. He had seen this before, and he knew how to handle it. He met Kale's charge head-on, their weapons clashing in a shower of sparks. The force of the blow was enough to shake the ground beneath them, but Cain held his ground. He was fast, his movements sharp, and he parried Kale's strikes with ease. The two men were evenly matched, their blows ringing out in the chamber like thunder. But Cain knew that this battle was more than just a physical fight. It was a battle for the future of humanity, a fight for survival. And in that moment, he poured everything he had into his strikes. He had nothing to lose. The battle raged on, their swords clashing again and again, each strike more powerful than the last. Kel's strength was unmatched, but Cain's resolve was unbreakable. He pushed forward, not just for himself, but for all the soldiers who had fallen, for the future of humanity that hung in the balance. With one final powerful strike, Cain disarmed General Kale, knocking his sword to the ground. The general fell to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief. Cain stood over him, his weapon raised, ready to end it all. "Any last words, General?" Cain asked, his voice steady. Kale sneered up at him, blood dripping from a cut across his face. "You think you've won, human. You're nothing. The Empire will rise again." Cain didn't respond. He didn't need to. With one swift motion, he brought his weapon down, ending the general's reign of terror. The command center fell silent. The humans had won. It wasn't just a victory of arms. It was a victory of spirit. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and now they were paying the price. Cain looked around at his soldiers, his comrades. They had fought and bled together, and now they had triumphed together. The Empire's forces had been decimated, and their grip on the station had been shattered. The human resistance had won, and the Cryo soldiers had proven that they were more than just a relic of the past. They were the future of humanity. As the smoke cleared and the station began to settle, Cain allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The fight was over. Humanity had survived, and they had proven that no matter how advanced the enemy, no matter how many times they were knocked down, they would always rise again. Cain turned to his soldiers, his voice filled with pride. "We've done it. The Empire is finished. Now, we rebuild." The battle was over, but the war for humanity's future had only just begun.